Wyoming Territory, 1867. While every buffalo hunter and freighter built their fires high and fast, burning sagebrush that sent smoke columns visible for 2 to 5 miles across open grassland, one Plains scout was digging a trench 18 inches deep and less than a boot wide. They called it a prairie grave. Called him paranoid. He'd learned the method from Lakota hunters who used hidden pits during winter buffalo hunts, and he'd read the Army manual that warned smoke could betray a camp from 10 miles under certain wind. He spent 40 minutes channeling the fire sideways into soil, packing the roof with sod. No flames rose above ground. No smoke lifted into the sky. Then just before dusk, riders appeared on the southern horizon, 8 or 9 mounted figures, 2 miles out and closing fast. Other camps still burned openly. Firelight reflected off pots and rifle barrels. But that trench fire? One boot heel, 10 seconds, and it vanished completely while those riders passed within 400 yards. What did he understand about visibility and survival that everyone else dismissed as needless caution? And why did the method they mocked become standard practice in Army manuals for the next 50 years? If you value real history with lessons, subscribe. Comment your city and time so we know where this reached. The scout knelt in the cottonwood draw with a folding shovel, clearing prairie soil down to hardpan. The trench ran 6 feet long, 18 inches deep, narrow enough that a man's boot could nearly span it. He angled the channel 10 degrees downwind, following the prevailing west-southwest breeze that moved steady across the high plains in late autumn. At the far end, he carved a small intake hole, no wider than a fist, slanted upward to meet the main channel 2 feet below the surface. The work took 35 minutes. He packed the roof with strips of sod cut from the draw bank, layering clay-heavy soil in overlapping sections that left no gaps. The intake hole remained open. The exit vent, positioned at the opposite end, stayed covered until the first coals formed. He used no stone, no iron grate, no purchased materials. The only tools were the shovel and a knife for cutting roots. 50 yards downstream, a buffalo hunter watched from beside his own fire, a standard surface ring built with cottonwood branches stacked in a loose pyramid. Flames rose 3 feet high, crackling as sap pockets burst. Smoke lifted straight into the clear evening air, visible as a gray column against the darkening sky. The hunter called over, asking why anyone would waste time burying a fire that worked fine in the open. He said the trench looked like a grave dug for a man too scared to be seen. The scout said nothing. He fed the first kindling into the trench through the intake hole, dry grass, then willow bark shavings, then cottonwood splinters no thicker than a pencil. He lit the bundle with a sulfur match and waited. Smoke appeared briefly at the exit vent, then thinned as the fire drew air through the intake and burned hotter. Within 10 minutes, the flames were invisible from 20 feet away. No light reflected off the surrounding brush. No sparks drifted downwind. He had learned the method from Pawnee hunters 2 winters earlier, men who used similar pits to cook buffalo meat during long hunts when rival bands moved through contested territory. They called it a breath fire, something that pulled air instead of pushing smoke. The scout had also read it described in a U.S. Army field manual from 1865, listed under patrol procedures for forward camps operating beyond supporting columns. The manual noted that surface fires could be spotted from 10 miles under favorable wind and clear atmosphere. The trench worked because it controlled oxygen. Fuel burned in short lengths, 12 to 16 inches, laid end to end rather than stacked. The narrow channel forced combustion gases to travel horizontally through soil that acted as insulation and filter. Temperatures inside the pit reached 900 to 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough that smoke particles reburned before venting. What little exhaust remained dissipated within 15 yards, mixing with ground-level air that carried no visible plume. By contrast, the open fire downstream burned at 600 to 800 degrees, wasting heat upward into air that provided no resistance. Ash drifted on the breeze. Sparks traveled 30 to 50 feet before dying. On the plains, where cottonwood draws offered the only cover for miles, there was nothing to hide it. The fire announced presence, direction, and distance to anyone watching the horizon. The scout boiled coffee in a tin pot set directly over the trench vent. The water reached full boil in 14 minutes, using 4 pounds of wood. The open fire downstream burned 12 pounds in the same span to heat a similar pot. Less fuel meant less cutting, less noise, less time spent exposed along the creek bank where deadfall accumulated. The hunter downstream shook his head. He said a hidden fire meant fear, and fear meant weakness. The scout capped the trench with a flat stone and let the coals bank themselves. He kept the shovel within arm's reach. The fire stayed invisible because it starved itself of excess oxygen. A surface fire drew air from all directions, feeding flames that rose and wasted energy upward. The trench forced combustion into a controlled path. Air entered through the intake hole, traveled horizontally beneath the soil roof, and met fuel already burning in the narrow channel. The restricted flow meant incomplete combustion never spiked into open flame. What would have been smoke in an open fire reburned as it passed through the hottest section of the pit. The soil itself acted as both insulation and filter. Clay-heavy prairie dirt held heat without cracking, reaching temperatures between 400 and 600 degrees on the outer walls of the trench. Inside, where wood burned, the temperature climbed past 900 degrees. At that heat, organic particles that would normally rise as visible smoke broke down into carbon dioxide and water vapor. The exhaust that finally vented carried almost no particulate matter. What little remained dispersed within yards, mixing with air currents at ground level. The scout fed the fire in short sections. Each piece of cottonwood measured 12 to 14 inches, cut to fit the length of the trench without stacking. He laid them end to end, allowing the forward piece to burn down before adding the next. This prevented the choking effect of overlapping wood and maintained consistent airflow. The process required attention but no skill. A man could tend it while watching the horizon. Downstream, the open fire consumed wood 3 times faster. The hunter fed branches as thick as a wrist, stacking them in loose layers that allowed air to rush through gaps. Flames leapt high, visible from any ridge within 2 miles. Heat radiated outward and upward, warming the man's hands but doing little for the pot suspended above on an iron tripod. Half the energy escaped and used. Ash drifted east on the breeze, settling on gear and clothing. Sparks landed in dry grass 30 feet away, requiring constant vigilance to prevent ignition. The trench fire burned 4 to 5 pounds of wood per hour. The open fire required 12 to 15 pounds for the same cooking time. Over a full evening, the difference meant one man cut half a cord while the other cut a cord and a half. Less cutting meant less time spent away from camp, less noise echoing through the draw, less motion visible from high ground. The hunter still preferred his method. He said a man needed to see flames to know the fire lived. He claimed the trench took too long to build and offered no benefit worth the effort. The scout said nothing and laid another length of cottonwood into the channel. He had learned that men convinced by tradition rarely changed until tradition failed them. The shapes appeared just before full dark, moving south to north along the ridgeline 2 miles east of the draw. The scout counted 8 riders, possibly 9, spread in a loose line that suggested either patrol or pursuit. They moved fast enough to raise dust visible against the dimming sky. Distance made identification impossible, but intent didn't matter. Visibility did. The open fires along the cottonwood draw still burned. Downstream, the buffalo hunter's flame rose 3 feet high, throwing light that reflected off metal pots, rifle barrels, and the pale canvas of a supply wagon. Smoke lifted clean into the evening air, marking position as clearly as a surveyor's flag. Further north, another camp showed 2 fires burning within 50 yards of each other, their combined glow bright enough to read by. Men moved between the flames, silhouettes sharp against the light. The riders slowed. Their line compressed as they turned west, angling toward the draw. They were still more than a mile out, but the course change was clear. They had seen something. The scout stepped once to the trench and scooped dirt with his boot heel. The soil collapsed into the channel, smothering flame and cutting airflow in a single motion. He used the shovel to spread the material evenly, packing it level with the surrounding ground. The surface went cold within seconds. No sparks. No glow. No residual light. Beneath the soil, the banked coals retained heat, radiating into clay walls that would stay warm for another hour, but nothing showed above ground. He moved his gear into the brush 20 feet back from the fire site and crouched low. The trench location was invisible. No scorched earth. No ash scatter. No stone ring. A man could walk past it in daylight and see nothing but prairie grass and bare dirt. Downstream, the other camps scrambled. The buffalo hunter kicked his fire apart, scattering burning branches that still glowed red in the gathering darkness. He threw water from a canteen, but embers hissed and smoked, creating a white haze that drifted upward. The supply wagon camp tried to smother their flames with blankets, but firelight had already marked them. The damage was done. The riders closed to 400 yards, then 300. They slowed near the visible camps, horses stepping carefully through the uneven ground at the draw's edge. Voices carried across the distance, too faint to distinguish words but clear enough to confirm human presence. The mounted figures stopped, silhouettes against the last light in the western sky. They remained motionless for nearly 2 minutes, watching. The scouts' camp showed nothing. No fire. No movement. No reflection. The trench site blended with the surrounding terrain, indistinguishable from any other patch of cleared ground along the draw. The riders' attention stayed fixed on the downstream fires, where men now stood in plain view, uncertain whether to reach for weapons or raise hands in greeting. The mounted group turned north without approaching closer. They moved at a walk for another 100 yards, then spurred into a trot and disappeared beyond the ridgeline. The encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes. No shots fired. No confrontation. But proximity had been close enough that the scout could see individual horses and the shape of rifles carried across saddles. Downstream, men stood silent beside their scattered fires. One began gathering embers to rebuild. Another called out, asking if anyone knew who the riders were. No one answered. The question didn't matter. What mattered was that the fires had been seen, and the camps had been marked. The scout waited another 20 minutes before uncovering the trench. The coals beneath the soil were still hot, orange light visible when he cleared the packed dirt. He fed kindling into the channel and watched the fire draw air through the intake. Within 5 minutes, flames burned again, invisible from 10 feet away. He boiled water for coffee and ate hardtack without speaking to the men downstream. By morning, 2 camps reported horses missing. The supply wagon team woke to find their picket line cut and 3 animals gone, taken sometime between midnight and first light. The buffalo hunter discovered his spare mount wandering a quarter-mile downstream, hobbles removed but the animal too confused to flee further. He never learned whether the riders had returned or if opportunists working the same country had seen the fires and moved in after dark. Another camp, situated a mile north where the draw widened into grassland, packed their gear before sunrise and relocated entirely. They lost a full day's travel and 20 to 30 miles of westward progress, choosing distance over the risk of remaining visible. The men said nothing about fear, framing the decision as practical adjustment, but they moved quickly and kept watch on the eastern ridges as they traveled. The scout's camp remained untouched. His gear sat exactly where he had placed it. His horse grazed on the picket line, undisturbed through the night. No tracks appeared near his position. No evidence suggested anyone had approached within 100 yards. The trench fire had left no trace visible in darkness, and morning light revealed only bare soil where flames had burned 12 hours earlier. Word traveled by midday. Men from downstream camps walked over to examine the fire site. They asked how long it took to dig, whether the method worked in wind, and if the trench could be relit from banked coals. The scout showed them the intake angle, the sod roof construction, and the fuel placement technique. He explained that a 10 to 15 degree downwind slant prevented backdraft and that clay soil worked better than sand for heat retention. He demonstrated extinguishing the fire in under 10 seconds by collapsing dirt into the channel with a single motion. The buffalo hunter who had called it a prairie grave now asked for exact measurements. He wanted to know trench width, depth, and length. He asked whether cottonwood worked as well as other hardwoods and how much fuel the method saved over a full evening. The scout answered each question without commentary, offering dimensions and observations drawn from 2 years of use across Wyoming and Nebraska territories. One man noted that Army scouts operating ahead of survey columns had used similar methods, though he had assumed the practice was limited to military operations where silence mattered more than comfort. Another recalled seeing Pawnee hunters cooking with pits dug into creek banks, fires that produced almost no smoke even when burning green wood. The connections formed slowly, spoken aloud as men realized the technique had been present for years, dismissed as primitive or unnecessary until visibility became survival. Within a week, 3 more trench fires appeared along the freight route between Fort Laramie and South Pass. By the following spring, the method showed up in informal instruction passed between scouts and guides working contract positions with Army survey teams. No formal manual revision occurred immediately, but field officers began recommending concealed cooking fires for forward patrols operating in contested territory. The guidance appeared in marginal notes and verbal briefings, practical knowledge transferred through demonstration rather than doctrine. Army manuals published between 1874 and 1890 included references to smokeless cooking pits, describing them as effective methods for reducing detection risk in open terrain. The instructions specified trench dimensions, airflow management, and fuel requirements nearly identical to those the scout had learned from Lakota hunters years earlier. The manuals did not credit native practice directly, but the techniques matched too closely to be coincidental. What had been dismissed as excessive caution in 1867 became standard field craft within a decade. The men who laughed now taught the method to newcomers. Not because it was clever, but because it worked when visibility mattered and traditional fires failed. The scout never claimed credit for the knowledge. He had learned it from others and passed it forward the same way, through demonstration and result rather than argument. On the frontier, survival belonged not to the loudest fire, but to the one no one ever saw. The trench fire method spread quietly through the Rocky Mountain region and across the Central Plains over the following 2 decades. Scouts working between Fort Bridger and Fort Kearny carried the technique along established routes, teaching it to freight crews, survey teams, and independent trappers who valued concealment over speed. The knowledge moved through demonstration rather than publication, passed from men who had survived because they remained unseen to men who wanted the same advantage. By 1880, Army field manuals included detailed instructions for constructing smokeless cooking pits, describing trench dimensions of 6 feet long, 18 inches deep, and 12 to 14 inches wide. The manual specified intake and exhaust vent placement, recommended sod or clay roof construction, and noted fuel efficiency improvements of 60 to 70% compared to surface fires. The language was technical and impersonal, offering no attribution to native hunters or frontier scouts, but the measurements matched exactly what Pawnee and Lakota groups had used for generations. Military adoption formalized what had already become common practice among experienced plainsmen. Forward patrols operating beyond supporting columns used trench fires as standard procedure when moving through territory where detection carried immediate risk. Cavalry units on extended reconnaissance dug the pits as readily as they picketed horses, treating concealed cooking as basic field craft rather than specialized skill. Officers compiling after-action reports noted reduced fuel consumption, faster extinguishing times, and improved operational security, framing the method as tactical advantage rather than survival necessity. The technique appeared in civilian guides by the late 1880s. Manuals written for prospectors, homesteaders, and independent travelers included sections on building concealed fires, often copied directly from Army publications without modification. The instructions emphasized practical benefits, less wood cutting, no sparks, rapid extinguishing, but rarely explained the origin of the knowledge or credited the groups who had developed it over centuries of seasonal movement across open terrain. Trench fire construction showed up in World War I field manuals issued to American and British forces operating in France and Belgium. Soldiers dug cooking pits behind front lines, using the same principles of controlled airflow and horizontal venting that plain scouts had employed 50 years earlier. The trenches reduced smoke visibility in contested areas and conserved fuel in regions where wood was scarce. Military engineers praised the efficiency without recognizing that the method had been refined by hunters who cooked buffalo meat in winter camps long before European armies adopted trench warfare as doctrine. The scout who built the first trench in the Cottonwood Draw in 1867 never saw the method reach formal recognition. He continued working contract positions through the 1870s, guiding survey crews and freight trains across Wyoming and Montana territories. He taught the fire pit technique to dozens of men, always crediting Pawnee hunters as the source and always emphasizing that the method worked because it controlled what could be seen rather than what could be felt. He died in 1883, reported in a single line in a Fort Laramie log as a contract scout whose name appeared in no pension records and whose service left no formal documentation. The men he taught carried the knowledge forward. Some became Army scouts themselves, passing the technique to younger guides who had never met the original instructor. Others worked as independent freighters or settled into homesteads where concealed fires meant protection from opportunistic theft rather than organized pursuit. The method outlived the moment of mockery by decades, becoming so common that its origins faded into assumptions about who had always known and who had learned. Native groups who had used trench fires for generations watched the technique be described as frontier innovation, credited to Army field officers and civilian guides who formalized what had been taught to them without acknowledgement. Pawnee and Lakota hunters continued building the pits during seasonal hunts, as they had for longer than written records tracked, the knowledge embedded in practice rather than publication. The transfer had moved in one direction, from those who knew to those who needed to know, and the recognition moved elsewhere. By 1900, trench fires were considered standard outdoorsman skill, taught in scouting manuals and camping guides alongside knot tying and shelter construction. The method had been stripped of its specific history and repackaged as universal knowledge, accessible to anyone willing to dig a narrow channel and control airflow. The crisis that proved its value, riders on the horizon, stolen horses, camps relocated in fear, was forgotten in favor of efficiency metrics and fuel conservation statistics. The legacy was not in credit or recognition. It was in survival. Men who built trench fires in 1910 owed their knowledge to men who built them in 1870, who owed theirs to hunters who built them in 1830, and backward through generations who learned that visibility killed faster than cold ever did. The chain remained unbroken even as the names disappeared. On the frontier, and in every wilderness that followed, survival belonged not to the loudest fire, but to the one no one ever saw.